So I guess the first thing I'd like to say is to thank Tricia Rose for inviting me. I've been kind of developing a relation with Brown over the last few years, so I'm really happy to be back here. And what I'm going to talk about is about the findings and implications of a report that was released in June called the Latino Media Gap. And before I tell you what we discovered or what we learned by doing this report, I'd like to tell you where it came from. I was involved in the founding of an organization called the National Association of Latino Independent Producers, which is the largest Latino producer organization in the U.S. at this point. And I was a founding member, I was on the board, I was chair, I had different roles in the organization, and after 10 years, I kind of looked around and said, you know, we have done a lot, you know. We have made a difference in people's careers, we have made a difference to people's lives and specific productions and media that we have available now, but it also felt that in 10 years we hadn't accomplished that much. That the big picture pretty much was very similar to when we began. So that's what originated the Latino Media Gap. It was a moment that we felt we had to take to assess what's going on. Why is this moving so slowly? And kind of what can we do to make it move a little faster? And if you think about it, how the fact that things don't move very fast affects people's individual careers and affects, of course, the society as a whole. So that's the origin of it. So what did we do? We felt that it was very important to do a long-term historical assessment from the 40s to the present. Because every year, the studios, the marketing spins tell us there's more, there's less. It's very confusing. What's really going on? So we decided to do a long-term analysis that pretty much, particularly on leading actors and supporting actors, and in some cases behind the camera, from the 40s to the present. So what did we find out in our report? Well, the first thing we found out, which was kind of surprising, was that media representation of Latinos in front of the camera had actually been higher per capita in 2 or 3 prior years, if we include both television and film. The 40s, the 50s, and the 70s. I forgot I had that. So this is how it looks in film. So in the 50s, in the 40s, Latinos were, you know, well, I'll start with the 50s. In the 50s, Latinos were almost 2.8% of the population, and it was kind of the moment, you know, a little bit back here that we had the highest convergence of population to representation, and then it kind of went downward from there. Similarly, in scripted shows, the highest point would be 1950s, and the reason why is I Love Lucy. You had a Latino in the top 10 TV shows, and then it started kind of going down, then it spiked a little bit, and then it's an unstable kind of line. So when we compared this trends to, you know, we decided to say, okay, wait a minute, maybe because we're looking only at top 10 shows, we're seeing these trends and they're really not very good. Let's expand our measurement and let's look at the top 25 TV shows and Latino leads. And we saw that if we expanded it, you saw that in the 70s, 80s, and even 80s and 90s, you had more Latino leads. But then when you look at the extremes, the 50s and 2010s, we see that there was 1 lead in the 1950s and there was 1 lead in the 2010s. So actually, it didn't change much in terms of number of leads, but in terms of per capita, it changed a lot because the population skyrocketed between the 1950s and the present. So that's what we call the Latino media gap. That the number of people might increase a little bit, but in relation to the population, either it stays stagnant, it goes down, or it does move very slightly. Now, we used the 17% as our guide because it seemed like an elegant enough number, but then when we looked at trends with the 17%, trends to the 17% onto infinity, we saw that if it kept going this way, the 2 parallel lines were never going to meet. In other words, there were never going to be a moment where Latino representation caught up if it stayed on this track. Then we decided to say, okay, 17% is elegant, but what do we look at the demos and what do we look at population in specific capitals of entertainment, the top media markets? And we saw that the 17% doesn't even tell the whole story. Latinos are over 20% of the main so-called 18 to 34 demographic, so the gap is even bigger if you look at the key demo. And if you look at specific markets like New York, Miami, Chicago, LA, you see that it's, if you compare, let's say, Miami to what's on the screen in the top 10, you see that the gap is enormous. It's not only 17, it's 68%. So we try to envision, how does that look? Well, it's kind of the equivalent of not ever hearing about Illinois and California ever. So we had all the people that are kind of excluded by this. This is kind of look like this. Now, within those big trend that we saw that Latinos were pretty excluded, we saw two sub-trends that were very, very interesting, and one involved gender and one involved race. The one that involved gender is that if we break down the marginalization, we see that men are the one that's disappeared. And that actually women have become much more incorporated over time. So up until the 1990s, the majority of leading and supporting roles on television and film were held by men, Latino men. But since the 1990s, that started to change. So you start seeing Latino men pretty much disappear. And in fact, the only stereotype that has disappeared in this period is a male stereotype, the Latin lover. We've added a stereotype, we lost a stereotype, and the stereotype we lost was masculine. And then when we looked at TV, it was pretty much the same. Men had pretty much crashed. Women had a moment in the 2010s. You had Desperate Housewives, etc., and then started to crash in the leading category as well. But on television, 67% of the Latino roles over the last 3 years were actually played by women. So clearly, there's a major gender trend. So obviously, we felt, well, this is good, to have a lot more women present. But then we looked closely at some of the trends within the trends, and we said, well, a lot of these women are playing characters in fantasy films and animated films, so we don't see them. So I'm talking about Cameron Diaz in Shrek Forever, or America Ferrara in Train Your Dragon, or sometimes they're blue, like Zoe Saldana in Avatar. So that was one thing that caught our eye. So these women, although they were Latinas, they were not necessarily being identified as or playing anything resembling a Latino character. The second thing we noticed is that a lot of the numbers often refer to a particular star, and in the case of films, that particular star was Cameron Diaz. So Cameron Diaz is one of the biggest stars of the last 2 decades, and certainly one of the biggest Latina stars, but how many people think Cameron Diaz is Latina? Most people don't. You might have been surprised to learn she was. And this is the same, for instance, I'm not going to get into it, but Louis C.K. is another great example, right? Who is a Mexican-American, but nobody thinks of him that way, and so it kind of skews the numbers in some sense. So at the end, I think one thing that we can pick up later is like, why is this gender bifurcation happening? Why are women becoming much more incorporated and men are pretty much being relegated to very few roles and definitely not rival roles? Second trend, well actually this is Cameron. Second trend had to do with race, or the rise of the Afro-Latino star. Now, this is not altogether new. There have been Afro-Latino stars in the past, like Juan Hernandez, for instance, was a supporting actor in the 30s through the 60s, was a Puerto Rican. But recently, in the last 10 years, and much more in the last 3, you have more and more Afro-Latinos playing roles, to the point that from 2010 to 2013, you had Afro-Latinos play from 16 to 20% of roles, when supposedly, according to the census, which is not totally reliable, Afro-Latinos are about 2.5% of the Latino population. So they were so-called over-indexing significantly. So we hypothesize some reasons why this is happening. One of them is that the Afro-Latino actor can actually audition for African-American and for Latino roles. There are many more African-American roles. So the majority of roles that Afro-Latinos play are African-American roles. And the second reason is that Afro-Latinos are often seen as desirable in the sense that they can interpolate 2 different demos, African-American and Latino, in the same market by constructing slightly different marketing campaigns. Now, this doesn't always work. As we know, in the Nina Simone film, where Zoe Saldana was cast as Nina Simone, and there was a big backlash, and we can kind of circle back to why does it generally work, but it didn't work in that particular case. And the other thing we should say about the Afro-Latino trend is that it applies to in front of the camera, but it does not apply behind the camera. There's virtually no Afro-Latinos talent that we found working behind the camera in the top 10 movies and television shows. Now, of course, a report on this topic cannot be, you cannot miss talking about stereotypes. And we discovered a lot of things about stereotypes, but I'll highlight a couple. One of them is what we could call the narrowing of roles. Up until the 1990s, you could have a character that was an artist, a photographer, a band leader, something like that. Now, virtually, those things don't exist. If you're Latino on screen or on television, you're going to be a cop or you're going to be a criminal, mostly. Or, you're going to be a menial labor or blue-collar labor, or you're going to be a maid, a male gardener or a maid, basically. And within that, though, there was some sub-trends that were very interesting. And one of them is that when you counted in absolute numbers, you had about the same number of criminals than you had of cops. But when you counted by appearances, you had, for every criminal, you had 3 cop appearances. Which means that there were many more cops that you feel like it crowded the space much more than the criminals. One of the reasons that's the case is because the cops or the law, sometimes it was a military or quasi-military character, is that these are characters that are on the show on a routine basis, while the criminals are throwaway characters. So you see the law enforcer significantly more. Now, a lot of people would feel that it's much better to be the law enforcer than to be the criminal. But if you couple that with the fact that since the 1990s, mid-1990s, the maid stereotypes begins to be associated with Latinas, you have that 2 of the most visible ways that Latinos are viewed are as police officers or military and maids. One thing that those 2 things have in common is that their job is to reproduce the social order and uphold it and protect it. So if you think then in the big canvas, what is it that Latinos are doing on screen most of the time? Well, most of the time, that's what they're doing. They're non-threatening, taking care of the white people, basically. And it seems that that's the most successful way that Latinos have become incorporated from a storyline point of view. And then the last thing I'd say about this count that we did that was surprising is that 44.7% of the total number of Latino roles on television were unnamed or uncredited, which means that almost half of the time that you see a Latino on screen, they have no bearing on the story and they're totally in the background and they don't matter. If they were never there, it wouldn't matter. Which is, I think, another kind of big picture thing, which is Latinos don't really matter. And I'll come back to that when we get to the diversity section. Now, I won't talk too much about news, but I'll say that the news category is about the worst. Less than 1% of stories feature Latinos. 66% of those stories are about crime or lawbreaking. There's not a single Latino anchor of a national, top national show, and there's no Latino executive producer, and there's only 1.8% producers. Now, the importance of this is that in many ways, entertainment and information seem to be saying the same thing and kind of consolidated this reality that, hey, Latinos are few, they don't matter, and when they're around, they're trouble. And this kind of hardens, and in the new report that I'm working on, which is about Latinos in comedy, one of the things that's interesting is how news actually also feeds entertainment. So for instance, what are the jokes about in late night shows? They're about what's being covered in the news. So this is not an isolated thing, but the lines between the 2 realms are actually very porous. So we can't just, separate that way. So of course, when we get to this point, we're like, wait, why is this happening? And we kind of took 2 looks at that. The first thing was like, who's at the top? Who's making these decisions? All right, so we found that there's only 1 Latina making decisions of 453 executive, which is Nina Tassler, and that kind of looked like this. So 1.9% of the top decision makers are Latino, but that's really just 1 individual, who's the chairperson of CBS. So we said, okay, so let's get deeper into this. Let's talk to some folks on the ground, and we talked to many advocates, producers, and executives within the studios and within the networks. Particularly, we talked to diversity executives. It is the job of the diversity executive to diversify. But one of the striking things in talking to the diversity executives was that all of them pretty much said, diversity will never happen through diversity. And then we said, okay, so what does that mean? So I took out a few quotes from the very rich kind of discourse that we exchanged with them. And the first thing they said is that the comfort zone, that executives only hire people they know and they're comfortable. What was interesting about this underlying assumption is that only the people that share your demographics are to be trusted. So in other words, new people are being added to the network all the time, of the same backgrounds as the people, but they're not seen as a threat. The people that are seen as a threat are the people that don't share the same background, right, or identities. So it's like trust only your own kind. Another thing that's related to that a lot of people converged on was the fear of displacement. And what they meant by that is that when people outside of the network that don't look like you start coming up, it feels like a threat also because if they are let in, we are going to lose out. You know, so that's, and that applies not only to the kind of, let's say, white male power structure that dominates, that also applies to people among racialized groups as well. In fact, one of the things I want to test in my next work, if that's actually true. Is it actually true that if you have more Latinos, African Americans suffer? I am not sure if that's true, but that's what people believe, and people sometimes act accordingly. The fourth thing that people said is that diversity is a front. One of the reasons that diversity executives cannot diversify is that they are the least powerful executive. They cannot make anybody do anything. You know, so to create an executive position where the only thing you can really do is count heads and report year after year. You cannot tell someone, you have to follow the policy and you have to do it in this manner, right? And of course, some people felt the beauty of that is that it's a top-down industry, so if the head of the company said, that's going to go, it would have to go that way. So obviously, they don't want it to go that way, necessarily. Then there's two macro reasons that I think popped up a lot. One was that there was the sense that Latinos that the companies didn't really have to do anything to incorporate Latinos because Latinos are not discriminated against because they just got here. They really don't have a long history in America, so you can't really say that the reason that they're not in media is because people discriminate. So therefore, Latino inclusion is not considered a public good, and that's a big contrast with African Americans, at least in front of the camera, because behind the camera, it's a different reality. But in front of the camera, I think would be very few people, if anybody, that would say such a thing, but saying it about Latinos, people feel pretty comfortable. And then we get that, we live in a post-racial world, the president is African-American, you can't be talking about this anymore. And the bottom line is that Hollywood does what they can do to get money, and that's the end of the story. Well, actually, that's not. Well, we tried to test that premise, and we took a look at a few shows, a few radio and television, and a film franchise, and we saw that clearly when you have diversity in those shows, you actually make more money. So the money rationale actually doesn't explain the behavior entirely. So for instance, ABC was kind of dying in 2003-2004 season, and they decided to greenlight a number of diverse shows, which is now why we have thank God it's Thursday probably, because diversity became what saved ABC, right? So that would be kind of an exception. Not all networks are on this boat, but that's what the experience was. They greenlight Desperate Housewives, Ugly Betty, Lost, etc. Then we looked at the Fast and the Furious. And Latino themes, characters, storylines, locations, and music heavily correlated with profits. So you see in Tokyo Drift, there were none of it, and it was the lowest amount of money that the franchise made. In opening night weekend and opening night day, Latinos actually constitute almost half of the public domestically of the Fast and the Furious franchise. So therefore, what's the conclusion that we can draw from here is that sometimes control can be more important than making a little bit more money. because clearly if they put more diversity, they make more money. So there's a resistance there that can be located somewhere else. Then lastly, of course, it's still kind of depressing. So it's like, what's happening online? What's happening with consumer advocacy? And I guess I have two ideas that I'll leave you. One of the things we discovered is that whereas in the 1960s, it would take a campaign about 4 years to be successful, let's say the Frito Bandito campaign, to take this cartoon character that was deemed offensive by many Mexican Americans. Today, it could take you anywhere from 2 weeks to a couple of months to take down a TV show like Blue Dogs Tonight, or a show like Work It or Rob. So in that regard, part of the good news is that with the advent of the internet and access and social media, because the consumer has become so much more important to the success of anything, if the consumer doesn't respond as expected or as desired, it could have enormous consequences to whatever it is in a very short period of time. And without that much money, as it was before, where you needed boots on the ground in a particular way, right? And also the amount of people that need to be involved in a campaign to influence media can also be fairly small if you think about it. With about 10,000 people texting CNN, you could get a show off the air if you're persistent enough. So in that regard, I would say that the last kind of parting idea would be that as consumers, as advocates, we actually have a lot more power than we use. If you think about Latinos supposedly having $1.6 trillion market, and when people talk about that power, they talk about just meaning that we buy stuff. But instead of meaning we buy stuff, we say we're critical of how we spend our money, then you can translate that consumer power into other kinds of power. And I would say that that was kind of the main invitation that at the end we were making the people reading the report. You have more power than you have, and you should use it. Thank you so much.